I had been on the road for almost 12 hours that day, trying to get ahead on a delivery so I could take the weekend off. I've driven these deserted highways in Montana plenty of times, but there's always a knot in my stomach when night falls. The solitude of the road can be oddly peaceful, but there's something about rest stops that never sits right with me. Maybe it's the complete silence or the thought that anyone could show up. It was almost 2 a.m. when I decided to pull over at one of those places. My eyes were shutting on their own, and it was better to catch some sleep before something went wrong. The place was practically empty, except for one car parked on the far side of the lot. It looked like an old sedan, and its lights were on with the engine running. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just another driver warming up or waiting for someone. I parked my truck on the opposite corner, far enough to not bother or be bothered. I locked the cabin, pulled the curtains shut, and lay down on the small bunk I always carry with me. Even with the exhaustion, something was bugging me. Maybe it was the constant hum of that car's engine breaking the silence in a way that felt off. It took me a while to fall asleep, but when I finally did, I woke up to a noise I couldn't identify. I glanced at the clock, 2:45. The car was still there, but it seemed closer. I thought it was my imagination, but it definitely wasn't in the same spot I'd seen it earlier. The lights were still on, and the engine was still running, but now it was parked just 2 or 3 spaces away from my truck. I sat there for a moment, watching through the gap in the curtain, trying to figure out why someone would move their car in the middle of the night to park closer. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just paranoia, but my whole body was on edge. I closed the curtains again, but this time left a wider gap to keep an eye on things without being seen. About 15 minutes later, the car moved again. Now it was parked right next to my truck, in the spot directly beside me. The engine was still idling, but now the lights were off. My heart started racing, and my mind jumped to all the stories I'd heard about robberies and strange encounters from other truckers. Something was wrong, and my gut knew it. For a few minutes, nothing happened, and I started to question if I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a coincidence, someone else trying to rest like me. But then I saw movement. A bright light from a flashlight swept across the windows of my truck. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I ducked down onto the bunk, trying to stay out of sight. The light moved slowly across the cabin, like it was searching for something or someone. Then I heard heavy footsteps on the asphalt, coming closer to the driver's side door. The person knocked on the window. 3 firm, dry knocks, followed by a muffled voice. "Hey, you in there? I need some help." My throat was dry and my hands were trembling. Something about the tone of his voice felt off. It didn't sound like someone in distress. It sounded forced, almost like he was reading a script. I didn't answer. I stayed completely silent, but my heart was racing, and I was sure he could hear it. The flashlight swept across the cabin again, this time shining directly through the gap in the curtain. "I know you're in there," the voice continued, now sounding more irritated. "I just need some help. My battery died." That was a blatant lie. The car's engine was still running. I grabbed my phone and checked for a signal. Nothing. No bars. That wasn't surprising out here, but in that moment, it felt like the worst thing in the world. My only option was to trust myself. I remembered the tire iron I kept under the driver's seat. It was the only thing I had to protect myself. Carefully, I reached for it without making a sound. Meanwhile, the guy outside started knocking harder. "Open the door, man! You can't leave me out here!" There was something in his tone that sent chills down my spine, a mix of anger and barely restrained desperation. Finally, I got hold of the tire iron and sat quietly, waiting. I didn't know what to do. If he tried to get in, I was ready to defend myself, but I prayed he'd just give up and leave. Then I heard something that froze me completely. The sound of the door handles being tested, first on the driver's side, then on the passenger side. He was trying to get in. At this point, my mind was racing. He was trying to open the doors, and the sound of the metal rattling under pressure made time feel like it was slowing down. I tried to remember if I had locked everything, and thankfully, I had. But even so, hearing him tugging on the handles repeatedly sent shivers down my spine. He circled the truck, passing in front of the cabin. I heard him knock on the passenger side window this time, harder. "You can't just sit there! Open up, damn it!" he shouted, and this time the anger was no longer restrained. The flashlight was now shining directly on the glass, and I could make out his figure. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a baseball cap that partially hid his face. I couldn't see much more than that, but I could feel his impatience growing with every passing second. The only thing separating us were those locked doors. I started to think he might try to break the window. I looked around, thinking about a way to escape, but there wasn't one. My truck was both my sanctuary and my prison. Suddenly, the sound of the car's engine got louder, like he had revved it. I peeked through the curtain and saw the car backing up a few feet. What was he doing? Then it hit me. He was trying to line the car up with my driver's side door as if he was preparing for something. Panic set in, but I knew I had to stay calm. I grabbed my phone again, even without signal, and opened the camera. I recorded everything: the car, the license plate, and the shadowy figure behind the wheel. At least if something happened to me, someone would find that video. The car moved forward again, stopping just inches from my truck. He got out of the car, this time holding something in his hand. It looked like a piece of metal, a crowbar or something similar. He started hitting the side of the truck, shouting words I couldn't make out. That's when I realized I had no other choice. I turned the ignition, and the roar of my truck's engine broke through the tension. I shifted into gear, not knowing where I'd go in the darkness, but staying wasn't an option. The roar of my truck's engine echoed through the rest stop, and the man froze for a moment. It was like he hadn't expected me to react. But within seconds, he started hitting the side of the truck harder, yelling something that sounded like, "You're not going anywhere." I wasn't willing to find out what he wanted. I slammed into reverse, and the truck jolted as I adjusted the wheel. He stumbled back, nearly losing his balance, and stood there staring at me, the flashlight shaking in his hand. Those few seconds felt like a blur. My heart was pounding, but I managed to swing the truck toward the exit. In the rearview mirror, I saw him run back to his car, still clutching the piece of metal. He jumped in, and to my disbelief, his headlights came on. He was following me. I'd heard stories about drivers being chased before, but living through it was entirely different. The road seemed endless, and the darkness around me felt like it was closing in. I knew I had to lose him, but my truck wasn't as nimble as his car. He was gaining on me, flashing his high beams like some kind of warning. I took a right turn onto an exit, trying to leave the main highway and buy some time. The road led to a dirt path, narrow and rough, disappearing into the middle of nowhere. Dust kicked up behind me, but his headlights stayed visible. Every bump on that path rattled the truck, and I prayed it wouldn't lose traction. Finally, I saw a small clearing ahead, with an abandoned shed surrounded by trees. I pulled the truck off the path and parked behind the trees, turning off the lights. I sat there in complete silence, clutching the tire iron like it was my last line of defense. The car's headlights appeared in the distance, but they passed by the entrance to the clearing without stopping. I stayed frozen, counting the seconds as my breathing slowed. The silence returned, but the fear remained. It was one of those nights where the silence feels heavy, and every sound from the engine seems louder than it should. I've been a trucker for over 15 years, but I always avoided routes that forced me to drive through remote highways in the middle of the night. This was back in October 2017, and I had taken a last-minute job transporting a load of farm equipment to a small town out in the country. The client was in a hurry, so I gave in. The radio wasn't working, and my only company was the occasional gust of wind hitting the truck. I was driving down a nearly deserted stretch of road, cutting through miles of dense forest. At that moment, my biggest worry was staying awake at the wheel. The road felt endless, the headlights only lighting up the asphalt ahead and the occasional tree along the edge. That's when I saw it, something unusual in the distance. Faint, blinking lights. I slowed down and realized it was a car, flipped over, with its hazard lights still on. My first thought was that someone might be trapped or hurt. I pulled the truck over onto the shoulder and grabbed my flashlight. Leaving the engine running, I stepped out to check. The air was cold, and the eerie quiet made the sound of my boots on the asphalt echo strangely. As I approached the car, I noticed the driver's side window was shattered, and the interior was completely empty. There was no one in the seats, no bags, nothing to suggest who the owner might be. What caught my attention were the footprints on the asphalt, muddy tracks leading straight into the woods. That detail made me uneasy, but I started following them anyway, shining my flashlight on the ground. The prints were fresh, that much was clear. With every step, my heart beat faster. Who would leave their car and head into the woods at this hour? Before I could come up with an answer, I heard something. It was a low, faint creaking sound coming from the direction of my truck. I turned quickly and saw that the headlights had gone out. The truck was now completely dark, except for the faint flicker of the cab light, which blinked irregularly. A shiver ran down my spine. I knew I'd left the engine running. Seconds later, I heard the sound of something dragging around the truck, heavy and deliberate, like someone, or something, circling it. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. The flashlight shook in my hand, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest like it was about to burst. Logic told me it was probably just an animal, but something about the way the sound echoed made it seem like it wasn't that simple. I took a deep breath and decided to head back to the truck. As I walked slowly, I tried to shake the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. The forest seemed darker now, almost as if the shadows had grown thicker. I glanced around, trying to spot whatever was making the noise, but I saw nothing. When I reached the truck, I noticed the driver's door was slightly ajar. That stopped me in my tracks for a few seconds. I was absolutely certain I had closed it before getting out. Shining my flashlight inside, I took a cautious step forward. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. My keys, which should have been in the ignition, were now lying on the passenger seat. That detail sent a chill through my entire body. Who or what could have done that? Still, there was no sign of anyone nearby. Suddenly, a loud thump came from the back of the truck, as if something had hit the trailer. Instinctively, I shouted, as though that might scare off whatever it was. "Is someone there?" I called out, trying to sound firm, but my voice trembled. I walked toward the rear of the truck, flashlight sweeping every inch of the area. Nothing was visible, but the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. It was as if I wasn't alone, even though I couldn't see anyone. I was beginning to regret stopping. That's when I heard it again, that dragging sound, this time coming from under the truck. My body froze. The flashlight shook as I crouched down slowly to look. The beam revealed something that made my blood run cold. Marks on the ground, as if claws or nails had been dragged through the dirt. There weren't any human footprints, just those strange, deep grooves leading to the back of the truck and disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I stood up quickly, every instinct in me screaming that something was very, very wrong. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation for what I'd just seen. Maybe it was a large animal, or maybe someone was playing a cruel prank. But deep down, I knew none of it made sense. I decided it was time to leave. I climbed back into the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. The silence inside was even more oppressive. I grabbed the keys from the passenger seat and slid them into the ignition. To my horror, the engine wouldn't start. I tried again and again. Nothing. The truck seemed completely dead, as if something had drained all its energy. The radio, which had only been emitting static before, now started making a strange noise. A low, intermittent hum that sent chills up my spine. I looked in the rearview mirror, hoping not to see anything moving in the dark. That's when I felt it, Something hit the windshield, like a hand, or something resembling a hand, pressing against the glass. My entire body froze, unable to move for several seconds. With the flashlight still in my hand, I pointed it forward, but there was nothing there, just my own terrified reflection in the glass. The hum from the radio grew louder, and then, out of nowhere, a voice whispered something unintelligible. It wasn't any language I knew, just guttural, distorted sounds that seemed to come from somewhere far away, or maybe far too close. I instinctively covered my ears, but the sound felt like it was inside my head. I shut my eyes tightly, trying to focus, trying not to lose control. When I finally opened my eyes, the radio had gone silent. The stillness returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was worse. Worse because I knew this wasn't over. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. Nearly an hour had passed since I stopped on the road, but it felt like time had frozen. Summoning every ounce of courage, I decided to try starting the truck one last time. I turned the key, and this time the engine roared to life as if nothing had happened. A mix of relief and dread washed over me. I knew I had to get out of there immediately. As soon as the engine started, I threw the truck into gear and floored it, not daring to look back. The road felt longer now, as if it had stretched out on purpose. The headlights illuminated only the asphalt ahead and the edges of trees on either side, but for some reason, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror. Something inside me screamed that I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it. I can't fully describe what it was, a tall, shapeless shadow running alongside the road, keeping up with the truck. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but even so, that thing stayed there, sometimes disappearing into the darkness of the trees, only to reappear farther ahead. The only thing I could make out was that it didn't have a fixed shape. It was constantly shifting, stretching, shrinking, but always moving at that horrifying speed. Suddenly, a loud metallic bang echoed from the roof of the cab, as if something had landed on top of the truck. That's when pure adrenaline took over. With one final burst of courage, I pushed the truck to its limit. The tires screeched, and I felt the vehicle shudder as if it might fall apart. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw lights in the distance, a gas station. The place was brightly lit, and I knew it was my only chance to escape. I pulled into the lot with a screech of brakes and practically jumped out of the cab. I looked up at the roof of the truck, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there. No marks, no signs. It was as if it had all been in my head, but I knew it wasn't. I stumbled into the gas station, still catching my breath, and explained what had happened to the attendant, a guy named Tom. He listened with a serious expression, but to my surprise, didn't seem shocked. "You're not the first trucker to talk about weird stuff on that stretch of road," he said, lighting a cigarette. "A lot of people have seen things they can't explain." I wanted to ask more, but something told me to let it go. I refueled, had a coffee, and continued my journey. To this day, I don't know exactly what happened that night, but one thing is certain. I've never driven that stretch of road again, and I never will. I was a truck driver at the time, hauling long-distance deliveries and spending days on the road. It paid the bills, and I even enjoyed the solitude. There was a certain freedom in having the open road ahead and the sky changing colors as the hours went by. It was around 1 a.m., and I was driving through a desolate stretch of highway in rural Kansas, surrounded by endless fields. The only sound besides the hum of the truck engine was the static from my CB radio, which I kept on more out of habit than need. That's when I first heard the voice. It was a woman, speaking hurriedly, almost like she was whispering. The message wasn't clear, but what I caught was enough to grab my attention. "Help. I'm stranded. Route 48, near mile marker 112. Route 48. I was on it. I glanced at the dashboard and saw the mile marker wasn't far off. My gut told me to ignore it, but something about her voice unsettled me. It didn't sound like a prank or interference. It was urgent, and I couldn't shake it off. I reached mile marker 112 a few minutes later. Slowing down, I scanned the side of the road. That's when I saw the headlights of a car parked awkwardly, almost in the ditch. I pulled over, grabbed my flashlight, and walked toward it. At first glance, the car seemed empty, but what made my skin crawl was the driver's door, wide open. There were no signs of anyone nearby, and the only sound was the cold wind rustling through the fields. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But my voice felt swallowed by the vast emptiness. As I inspected the car, the CB radio in my truck started crackling again. This time the voice was clearer and it was calling my name. "Jake. Jake, help. Please." My blood ran cold. I hadn't mentioned my name, and there was no one around who could know it. I turned to look at the truck, parked a few yards away, its cabin light casting a faint glow on the roadside. The radio was still crackling, but I was frozen, trying to comprehend how any of this was possible. The eerie feeling that I wasn't alone was suffocating. My heart was racing, but I decided I needed to get back to the truck. Maybe it was some weird interference or a cruel prank. Walking quickly, I moved toward the cabin, but before climbing in, I glanced back at the abandoned car. I don't know why, but something about it felt off. There were marks on the ground leading away from the open door into the field. They looked like footprints, but dragged, as if someone had been pulled. "Damn it, Jake," I thought, "just get in the truck and drive." But curiosity, or maybe guilt, held me back. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I began following the marks. They were uneven, heading toward a small cluster of trees about 50 yards from the road. With every step, the darkness seemed heavier and the silence grew oppressive. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound behind me, like something moving in the brush. I spun around, shining the flashlight, but saw nothing. Then the CB radio started crackling again, only this time it wasn't coming from the truck. It felt like the voice was all around me. "Jake, you shouldn't be here." I froze. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run back to the truck, but my legs wouldn't move. The voice continued, now more insistent. "Why did you come, Jake? You shouldn't have come." My flashlight started flickering, and I swear I saw something moving between the trees. It wasn't a person. It was too big and too distorted to be human. I tried to step back, but tripped over something and fell. When I looked down, I realized I had landed on a bag, torn open with clothes and papers scattered. One of the IDs inside read Anna, the same name I had heard on the radio. That was it for me. I scrambled to my feet, shoved the flashlight in my pocket, and sprinted back to the truck without looking back. I don't know how I managed it, but I jumped into the cabin and locked the doors in one motion. The radio was still crackling, but now it was just faint static. My breathing was ragged, and my hands were shaking as I tried to start the truck. The engine hesitated, but when it finally roared to life, I threw it into gear and sped away. In my rearview mirror, I could see the abandoned car, and for a split second, I swear I saw a figure standing next to it, watching me leave. I drove for miles without stopping, keeping my eyes glued to the road and the CB radio turned off. My mind was racing with questions. Who was Anna? Was she really asking for help, or was it something else entirely? As much as I wanted to forget what happened, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. When I finally reached a 24-hour gas station, I pulled over and stepped out, still trying to calm myself down. The place was almost empty, except for an older clerk behind the counter and another trucker sitting with a cup of coffee. I headed straight for the counter and ordered a coffee, my hands still trembling. While I waited, I decided to search for the name Anna on my phone. I didn't expect to find anything, but the first news article that popped up hit me like a punch to the gut. Woman missing on Route 48, last seen 3 days ago. There was a photo of her, and even in my state of shock, I recognized the face. It was like I'd seen her before, though that was impossible. The article said the police had found her car abandoned, but no sign of what had happened to her. A chill ran down my spine. I knew exactly where that car was. but I also knew I couldn't tell anyone without sounding insane. For a brief moment, I thought about going back. Maybe I could give the police more information, but what would I even say? That I heard a voice on the radio and followed tracks into the field? That I saw something in the trees? Who would believe me? I finished my coffee in silence and returned to the truck, but that feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I glanced around the gas station, but everything seemed normal. Still, I climbed into the truck, started it up, and drove off, determined to leave that night behind me. The voice on the radio, the tracks on the ground, the figure in the rearview mirror. None of it made sense. To this day, I avoid Route 48. I don't know if what I encountered that night was real or some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination. All I know is that sometimes, when I'm out on the road, I get that same chilling feeling running down my spine. And the strangest thing of all is that, even with the CB radio turned off, I still hear a faint voice in the back of my mind, a voice whispering my name. I've always liked driving at night. There's something calming about cruising along empty roads, just me, my truck, and the steady hum of the engine breaking the silence. It was October 2013, and I was on an urgent delivery of industrial materials to a small town about 250 miles away. I'd been a trucker for a good 10 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. Reckless drivers, animals darting across highways, even strange lights in the sky during a trip through Kansas. But that night was different. And to this day, I still don't know how to explain what happened. It all started around 2 a.m. The highway was deserted, as it usually is during these late-night hauls through rural areas. I had just left a gas station where I'd grabbed a coffee to keep me awake when I noticed the headlights of a vehicle behind me. At first, it was nothing unusual. I figured it was another long-distance driver or someone heading to one of the small towns along the route. But after a few miles, I began to notice something odd. The vehicle, an old pickup truck, was sticking too close to my tail. I switched lanes to see if it would pass me, but it stayed right behind. I slowed down slightly, hoping they'd go around me, but they didn't. Instead, the pickup adjusted its speed to match mine, as if we were connected. It had a strange look to it, an old model with faded paint and headlights that flickered faintly, like the electrical system was faulty. It was annoying, sure, but I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe the driver was distracted or just bad at keeping distance. After about 30 minutes of this, I started to feel genuinely uneasy. I decided to test them by taking a sharp turn onto a narrow side road, completely off the main highway. It wasn't ideal for my route, but I knew the area and figured I could loop back to the main road after a few miles. As soon as I made the turn, I watched the headlights in my side mirror. Sure enough, the pickup followed, its lights bouncing as it navigated the uneven road. That's when I felt the first chill run down my spine. I started to sweat, even though the AC was blasting. I was used to long hours behind the wheel, but the feeling of being followed was something I couldn't shake. I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Maybe the driver was heading to the same town. But as I glanced in the mirror, I noticed something unsettling. The pickup's headlights flickered in an irregular rhythm, almost like they were pulsing in time with my own racing heartbeat. It was subtle, but enough to make me question if I was really seeing it. After a few more miles, I knew I had to act. I grabbed my CB radio and called out on the trucker's frequency, hoping someone nearby might respond. "Anybody out here on Route 47? I've got a pickup tailing me. Anyone else seen this guy?" The radio crackled for a moment before a rough, static-filled voice came through. "Route 47? Get off that road, man. You're not supposed to be there this late." Before I could ask for clarification, the line went dead. That only added to my growing paranoia. My next idea was to speed up. My rig was heavy, but I figured I could put some distance between us if the pickup was as old and clunky as it looked. I pressed down on the accelerator, feeling the engine roar as the speedometer climbed. For a moment, It seemed to work. The headlights began to fade into the distance. My heart started to calm, but then the lights disappeared entirely. Just gone, like the truck had vanished into thin air. I thought maybe they'd finally given up, but the relief didn't last long. 2 minutes later, a blinding light flooded my rearview mirror, illuminating the entire cab. It was the pickup again, but this time it was much closer, as if it had materialized out of nowhere. My blood ran cold. And then, my engine started sputtering, something it had never done before. That's when I realized this wasn't just a reckless driver. Something far more sinister was happening. I knew I had to pull over and figure out what was going on. The next opportunity was a way station, about 3 miles ahead. My plan was simple: face the situation head on. Maybe the driver needed help or was dealing with some sort of issue. It was easier to believe that than to think something much stranger was going on. I kept the truck moving, even as the engine struggled, and made my way toward the station. The pickup's lights stayed locked onto me, flickering in that same unnerving pattern. When I finally reached the way station, I breathed a sigh of relief. The area was well lit and felt like a safer option than stopping on the dark, empty road. I parked my truck and turned off the engine, which, to my surprise, stopped sputtering the moment the vehicle came to a halt. The pickup followed me in, stopping just a few feet away. Now that it was closer, I could make out even more unsettling details. The windshield was coated in what looked like thick dust or soot, making it impossible to see inside. I stepped out of the cab with my flashlight in hand, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Walking to the front of my truck, I turned to face the pickup. The silence was oppressive. I waited for a few seconds, but no one got out. I took a tentative step forward, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark, trying to ignore the overwhelming feeling that something inside the vehicle was watching me. I shouted, "Hey, you okay in there? Need some help?" No response, just the wind brushing through the empty highway. As I got closer, the flashlight illuminated another odd detail. The pickup didn't have a license plate. The body of the truck was covered in deep scratches, as though something had tried to claw its way through the metal. My gut told me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached for the driver's side door handle, hoping it was locked. It wasn't. The door creaked open, revealing an empty interior. No driver, no signs of anyone ever being there. The air inside smelled burnt, and the steering wheel had a strange handprint on it, charred as if it had been touched by something far too hot to be human. I froze for a few seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. None of it made sense. The pickup had followed me for miles, reacting to every turn I made, and now it was completely empty? I slammed the door shut and started walking briskly back to my truck. But halfway there, I heard a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. The pickup's engine roared to life. Its headlights flickered wildly, and that same irregular sputtering noise filled the air. But this time, it didn't sound mechanical. It sounded alive, like a growl mixed with the screech of metal grinding against metal. I ran. I didn't think twice. I jumped back into my cab and locked the doors, fumbling to start the engine. It hesitated for a moment, longer than usual, like something was resisting it. When it finally roared to life, I looked in the rearview mirror. The pickup was still parked, its headlights glaring at me. I knew I needed to get out of there, but the weight of the situation was suffocating. Who or what was following me, and why? I pulled back onto the road, pushing the truck as fast as it could go. My only thought was to make it to the next town and find someone, anyone, who could help. But as I drove, I noticed the pickup's lights behind me again. Only this time, they weren't on the road. In my mirror, I could see them weaving through the trees lining the highway. It was moving at an impossible speed, cutting through the forest as if the laws of physics didn't apply. I pressed the accelerator harder, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Then, out of nowhere, the CB radio crackled to life. The same rough voice from before came through, this time clearer and more urgent. "Don't look. Don't stop. Don't let it in." Before I could respond, the radio went silent again. I didn't know who or what had sent the warning, but I knew I had to follow it. No matter what happened, I couldn't stop driving. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys silence on the road. Being a truck driver has its perks: the radio as your companion, long hours to think, and above all, the peace of being alone. That night in August, the weather was awful. It was pouring like the sky had split open, and the heavy raindrops pounded against the windshield, making a constant sound that almost lulled me into a trance. I was driving on a secondary highway somewhere in the countryside, far from any big city. My next stop was still 3 hours away, but the storm was slowing me down. The road was practically empty, and the only light, apart from my headlights, was the occasional flash of lightning. It was during one of those flashes that I first saw him. Standing on the shoulder of the road, drenched, wearing a dark jacket that seemed to have soaked up all the rain in the world. He was waving frantically, trying to get my attention. I hesitated, to be honest. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, especially at night. The road can be dangerous, and the last thing I needed was a stranger in my truck. But something about his desperate demeanor convinced me. Maybe it was the torrential rain or the emptiness of the highway. I hit the brakes and pulled over. He ran to the passenger door and climbed in, thanking me repeatedly as he wrung out his wet jacket on the floor. From the moment he got in, he seemed odd. At first glance, he looked normal enough: scruffy beard, messy hair, worn-out clothes. But there was something about his demeanor that unsettled me. He was shaking, but it didn't seem like he was cold. It was more like he was nervous. I tried to make conversation, asking where he was coming from and where he was headed. "I just need to get out of here," he said in a low voice, almost drowned out by the rain. I asked again, trying to be friendly, but he avoided eye contact, staring at the road as if trying to escape something. Something about him definitely felt off. As we drove, I kept an eye on him. He kept his hands on his lap, clutching what looked like a crumpled piece of paper. It irritated me more than it should have, maybe because the rustling noise was so persistent, or maybe because I couldn't figure out why he wouldn't let it go. I asked his name, but he gave me a quick, vague answer that I couldn't make out. After that, I decided to stay quiet. Something in his eyes, a mix of restlessness and something else I couldn't quite place, told me it was better not to press him. The rain kept pounding on the truck, and the road felt more deserted with every mile. I couldn't stop thinking about the hitchhiker sitting next to me. He barely moved, except for a repetitive gesture. His fingers kept crumpling and uncrumpling the piece of paper. It irritated me more than it should have, maybe because the sound was faint yet constant, or maybe because I couldn't understand why he wouldn't let go of it. I decided to break the silence, but before I could say anything, he interrupted me. "Have you ever seen something that you can't explain?" he asked, without looking at me. The question came out of nowhere, and for a moment I thought it was a strange attempt at small talk. I gave a short laugh, trying to ease the tension, but he stayed serious. "Sometimes things aren't what they seem," he continued, almost whispering. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, like there was something sinister hidden behind his words. I tried to change the subject, asking where he was from, but he ignored my question, his eyes fixed on the road. That's when I noticed something strange. Earlier, he had mentioned coming from a small nearby town, but now, without me asking, he started talking about taking the highway from the south, a completely different place. The inconsistencies in his story began to pile up. Every time he spoke, it was like he was inventing a new version of events. My gut told me to drop him off at the next stop, but I couldn't tell if it was paranoia or caution. After a few minutes of silence, he started muttering to himself, so low I could barely hear. I caught a few words, things like "shouldn't have stopped" and they're still there. By this point, I was regretting letting him into the truck, but there wasn't a gas station or rest stop in sight. I had no choice but to keep driving and hope the next town would come up soon. After a few more miles, I finally spotted a small gas station. It was tiny, with just 2 pumps and a convenience store that was closed. I pulled over, relieved to finally stretch my legs and, hopefully, get rid of the hitchhiker. I told him I needed to refuel, but he stayed seated, motionless, staring ahead as if he hadn't heard me. I grabbed some cash and stepped out of the truck, eager to get some fresh air. When I came back, he was gone. The passenger door was still locked from the inside, and the rain had washed away any footprints. The only thing he left behind was that crumpled piece of paper on the seat. I picked up the piece of paper carefully, as if it were something fragile or dangerous. It was damp, but the scribbled writing was still legible, though confusing. It looked like a hand-drawn map, full of arrows, circles, and words that seemed to be place names. Some were familiar, towns near the area, but others seemed more like instructions? In the center of the paper, one phrase stood out: "Never go back the way you came." What on earth did that mean? I looked around, trying to see if he was nearby, but the station was empty. Not a trace of him or anyone else, just the relentless sound of the rain and the wind starting to howl. A growing sense of unease crept over me. Something didn't add up. How had he left without me hearing him? Why did he leave that paper behind? I looked back at the road I had just driven, but it was as empty as before. I had an overwhelming feeling that something was watching me, hidden in the shadows. It was irrational, but at the same time, so strong that my whole body reacted. Sweaty palms, heavy breathing, every instinct screaming for me to leave. I didn't question it. I got back into the truck, started the engine, and drove off, refusing to look back. As I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about that piece of paper. I tried to piece together the inconsistencies in his story, the words on the paper, the way he disappeared, but none of it made sense. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The fuel gauge, which had been nearly empty when I stopped at the station, now showed a full tank, but I hadn't refueled. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting, or maybe dreading, to see him standing on the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the rain and the darkness. The road felt longer and more winding than before, as if it were stretching endlessly. The paper was still on the seat next to me, and despite trying to ignore it, I felt an almost irresistible urge to look at it again. I picked it up with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Claw marks on the edges of the paper, as if someone had gripped it so tightly it tore. The words in the center seemed sharper now. "Never go back the way you came." The sense that something was terribly wrong returned in full force, like an icy wave crashing over me. I knew I needed to keep my focus on the road, but my mind was completely consumed by that message and everything that had happened. The truck felt different, as if the engine was roaring louder than usual, or maybe it was just the silence around me making everything seem amplified. Suddenly, the GPS I had set up earlier started malfunctioning. The route disappeared, and the device emitted a strange static noise, like it was trying to pick up some signal. I tried to ignore it, but the discomfort was impossible to shake. I looked in the rearview mirror again, expecting, or maybe fearing, to see something, anything. But there was only darkness. Still, the oppressive feeling of being watched was suffocating. That's when it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, at the edge of the road, something moved. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me slam on the brakes. The truck came to a sudden stop, and the sound of the rain became deafening. I waited a few seconds before mustering the courage to look. There was a figure standing there, on the side of the road, illuminated only by the dim glow of the headlights. It was him, the hitchhiker. But something was different. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural, and his eyes, well, they were fixed on me, like two lifeless embers. I wanted to get out of there, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt a weight on my chest, like something invisible was pinning me to the seat. He took a step toward the truck, then another, his movement slow and deliberate. When he was about to reach the door, a surge of survival instinct took over. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal with all my strength. The truck jolted forward, and the figure disappeared from view. I kept driving, my hands trembling and my heart racing, not daring to look back. I only stopped when I finally reached my destination a few hours later. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had all been exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But the paper was still there, on the passenger seat. When I finally worked up the nerve to open it again, I noticed something new. There was a message on the back, written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. "Thank you for not going back." From that day on, I never picked up hitchhikers again. And to this day, whenever I think about that night, I can't help but wonder, if I had gone back the way I came, what would have happened?